The year was 1885, and the steam whistle of the Pennsylvania Railroad echoed through the industrial heart of Pittsburgh like a metallic prayer. Smokestacks reached toward the grey sky like iron fingers, and the clatter of steel on steel filled the air as workers hammered rails into place. Among them was Margaret O'Brien, a sturdy Irish woman whose calloused hands spoke of countless hours laying track under the unforgiving sun. Cornelius Blackwood stood on the platform of his private rail car, surveying his empire with the satisfaction of a man who had built something from nothing. At 45, he commanded one of the largest railroad networks in Pennsylvania. His wealth measured not just in miles of track, but in the sweat of thousands of workers who made his vision reality. His dark coat was tailored in New York, his pocket watch crafted in Switzerland. Yet his eyes held the calculating coldness of someone who had climbed from poverty to power. Margaret had caught his attention 3 months prior during a labor dispute. While other workers shouted and waved their fists, she had spoken with quiet authority, articulating their grievances with an intelligence that surprised him. She was different from the typical railroad worker, educated enough to read and write, yet strong enough to swing a sledgehammer for 12 hours straight. The meeting was arranged through his foreman, Patrick Murphy, in a small office beside the rail yard. The room smelled of coal dust and machine oil, the walls lined with maps showing the expanding web of Blackwood's railroad empire. Margaret sat across from him, her work dress clean but worn, her red hair pulled back in a practical bun. "Mrs. O'Brien," Blackwood began, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I have a proposition that could change your circumstances considerably." Margaret's green eyes remained steady. She had heard stories about men like Blackwood, railroad barons who treated workers like machinery to be used and discarded. "I'm listening, Mr. Blackwood." He leaned forward, his fingers steepled. "Your husband died in the rail yard accident last year, leaving you with considerable debts to the company store. I'm prepared to clear those debts entirely, plus provide you with $500 in gold, a substantial sum that could support you for several years." The amount was staggering. Margaret's monthly wages as a track worker barely covered her rent in the company boarding house and meals at the company dining hall. $500 represented more money than she had ever imagined possessing. "What would you require in return?" she asked, though something in his demeanor already suggested the nature of his request. Blackwood stood and walked to the window overlooking the rail yard, where dozens of workers moved like ants among the steel and steam. "I need an heir, Mrs. O'Brien. My wife has been unable to provide me with children, and at my age, time is becoming a precious commodity. I require someone of good health and intelligence to bear a child who will inherit my railroad empire." The industrial age had created new forms of contracts and arrangements, and wealthy men often made unconventional agreements to secure their legacies. Margaret had heard whispers of similar arrangements in other industrial cities, though never so directly proposed. "You're asking me to bear your child," she said plainly. "I am. The arrangement would be strictly business. You would be provided with comfortable accommodations during the pregnancy, the finest medical care available, and nutritious food. After the birth, you would receive your payment and be free to leave Pittsburgh if you choose." Margaret considered the offer carefully. Her current life offered little beyond daily survival, working alongside men who often resented her presence in their masculine domain. The death of her husband had left her isolated, struggling to pay debts that seemed to grow larger each month despite her steady work. "And the child," she asked, "would be raised as my legitimate heir with all the advantages my wealth can provide. The finest education, connections to powerful families, opportunities you could never offer alone." The weight of the decision pressed upon her like the heavy steel rails she helped position each day. Outside the window, the 5 o'clock whistle announced the end of another shift, and workers began their weary trudge toward the boarding houses and taverns that lined the industrial district. "I need time to consider your offer," Margaret said finally. Blackwood nodded, reaching into his vest pocket to withdraw a gold coin which he placed on the desk between them. "Take this as a gesture of good faith. You have until Sunday to decide." Margaret picked up the coin, feeling its substantial weight, more money than she typically earned in a week, given freely. She looked up at Blackwood, seeing not just wealth and power, but something else in his eyes, something that might have been loneliness. "Sunday then," she agreed, standing to leave. As she walked back toward the boarding house through streets lit by gas lamps and filled with the constant noise of industry, Margaret O'Brien carried more than just a gold coin. She carried the possibility of escape from a life of endless labor and the burden of a choice that would change everything. The railroad whistle sounded again in the distance, calling workers to the night shift, its voice echoing off the brick buildings like a mechanical lullaby for the industrial age. Sunday arrived with the tolling of church bells across Pittsburgh's industrial landscape. Margaret had spent 2 sleepless nights weighing Blackwood's proposition, her mind cycling between the promise of financial freedom and the moral complexities of the arrangement. The gold coin sat on her small wooden table like a silent witness to her internal struggle. She had sought counsel from Father McKenna at St. Patrick's Cathedral, though she could not reveal the specific nature of her dilemma. The elderly priest had spoken of difficult choices and the Lord's mysterious ways, but his words offered little clarity for her unprecedented situation. In the end, Margaret realized the decision rested entirely on her shoulders. The meeting was set for 10 o'clock at Blackwood's private office in the Pennsylvania Railroad headquarters, an imposing brick building that dominated the corner of Liberty and Grant Streets. Margaret wore her best dress, a dark blue wool garment she had sewn herself, and carried a small leather purse containing the gold coin. Blackwood received her in his personal office, a room that spoke of wealth and power through its mahogany furniture, Persian carpets, and oil paintings depicting railroad scenes. Behind his desk hung a large map showing his railroad network stretching across Pennsylvania and into neighboring states, marked with colored pins indicating stations, freight yards, and future expansion plans. "Mrs. O'Brien," he greeted her, rising from behind his massive desk. "I trust you have considered my proposal carefully." Margaret took the offered seat, her hands folded in her lap. "I have, Mr. Blackwood. I accept your terms, but I have conditions of my own." His eyebrows raised slightly, apparently surprised by her assertiveness. "Please, continue. First, I want the agreement documented in writing by a lawyer, not just a gentleman's handshake. Second, I want half the payment before the birth and half after to ensure your commitment to the arrangement. Third, I want to choose my own doctor, someone I trust." Blackwood leaned back in his chair, studying her with newfound respect. "You're more astute than I initially credited, Mrs. O'Brien. Very well, your conditions are acceptable. I'll have my attorney, Mr. Benjamin Hayes, draft the papers this week." He opened a desk drawer and withdrew a wooden box, from which he removed a stack of gold coins. "Here is $50 as an advance on your advance, if you will. Consider it compensation for leaving your current employment." Margaret accepted the coins, their weight substantial in her hands. More money than she had ever held at one time, yet somehow the moment felt less triumphant than she had imagined. "There is one more matter," Blackwood continued. "The arrangement must remain absolutely confidential. My wife Eleanor knows nothing of this agreement and must never learn of it. She believes I am providing housing for a distant relative who requires care during a difficult pregnancy." "And after the birth?" Margaret asked. "Eleanor will be told the child belongs to my deceased brother's family, orphaned and in need of our care. She has always longed for children, so she will welcome the baby gladly." The complexity of the deception troubled Margaret, but she understood the social conventions that made such arrangements necessary. A man of Blackwood's standing could not openly acknowledge an illegitimate child without scandal, yet the child would still inherit his empire through legal adoption. Within a week, the papers were signed in the presence of attorney Benjamin Hayes, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles who treated the unusual contract as if it were a standard business transaction. Margaret was provided with a comfortable room in a boarding house on the respectable side of town, far from the industrial district where she might be recognized. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the autumn months. Blackwood visited weekly, bringing books, fresh fruit, and updates on the railroad's expansion. Their conversations gradually evolved beyond the basic arrangements, touching on literature, current events, and Margaret's thoughts on the changing industrial landscape. She found him more complex than his initial proposition had suggested. Behind his businessman's facade lay someone who genuinely cared about his workers' welfare, who had established one of the first company hospitals and insisted on safer working conditions than many of his competitors. His desire for an heir seemed driven not just by vanity, but by a genuine wish to leave something meaningful behind. As winter approached, Margaret felt the child growing strong within her. She had chosen Dr. Sarah Mitchell, one of the few female physicians in Pittsburgh, despite Blackwood's initial objections. Dr. Mitchell provided excellent care while asking no uncomfortable questions about the unusual living arrangements. The railroad continued its relentless expansion during those months, with Blackwood often working 16-hour days, overseeing construction projects and negotiating with other railroad companies. The industrial age waited for no one, and fortunes could be made or lost based on the speed of expansion and the efficiency of operations. Margaret spent her days reading, walking in nearby Shenley Park, and preparing for the birth that would change both their lives forever. She had no way of knowing that the child she carried would bring revelations that neither she nor Cornelius Blackwood could possibly anticipate. The first snows of winter began falling in December, covering Pittsburgh's industrial landscape in pristine white that would soon be stained grey by coal smoke and factory emissions. The labour pains began on a bitter February morning in 1886, when Pittsburgh lay buried under 2 feet of snow, and the railroad operations had slowed to accommodate the harsh winter conditions. Margaret had felt the first contractions while reading beside the window of her boarding house room, watching workers clear snow from the tracks below. Dr. Sarah Mitchell arrived within the hour, her black medical bag cutting through the white landscape like a symbol of purpose. She had attended dozens of births in Pittsburgh's growing population, but few under such unusual circumstances. The arrangement between Margaret and Blackwood had been explained to her in the most general terms, enough to ensure proper medical care without compromising confidentiality. "The baby is coming quickly," Dr. Mitchell announced after her examination. "This child seems eager to enter the world." Margaret gripped the iron bed frame as another contraction swept through her. Outside, she could hear the distant whistle of a locomotive fighting through the snow-covered rails, a reminder of the industrial empire that would soon claim this child as its heir. Cornelius Blackwood paced in the boarding house parlour below, his usual composure cracked by anxiety. He had cancelled 3 important business meetings to be present for the birth, something that had not gone unnoticed by his business associates. The Pennsylvania Railroad's Board of Directors expected their president to maintain absolute focus on expansion plans, especially with competing railroads pushing into their territory. The birth took place as the afternoon sun struggled through grey winter clouds. Dr. Mitchell worked with quiet efficiency, guiding Margaret through the final stages of labour with gentle encouragement. When the baby's first cry echoed through the room, it seemed to answer the locomotive whistle outside, as if announcing its arrival to the industrial world that would shape its future. "It's a healthy baby," Dr. Mitchell announced, lifting the newborn for Margaret to see. But as she cleaned the infant and prepared to hand the child to its mother, Dr. Mitchell's expression changed. Her professional composure faltered for just a moment before returning, though her hands moved with slightly less certainty. Margaret, exhausted but alert, noticed the hesitation immediately. "What is it, doctor? Is something wrong with my baby?" Dr. Mitchell wrapped the infant carefully in a clean blanket before responding. "The child is perfectly healthy, Mrs. O'Brien, but there is something Mr. Blackwood needs to see." She carried the baby downstairs to where Blackwood waited, his face etched with the anxiety of a man whose entire future depended on this moment. He had built his railroad empire through careful planning and calculated risks, but the birth of his heir represented something beyond his control. "Congratulations, Mr. Blackwood," Dr. Mitchell said, extending the bundled infant toward him. "You have a beautiful, healthy daughter." Blackwood accepted the baby with trembling hands, his face lighting with joy as he looked down at the small face peeking from the blanket. But as his eyes focused on the child's features, his expression transformed from joy to confusion, then to something approaching shock. The baby's skin was darker than either Margaret's pale Irish complexion or his own. Her hair, though sparse, showed signs of a texture unlike either parent. Most telling were her eyes, already showing hints of a warm brown that belonged to neither the green-eyed Margaret nor the blue-eyed Blackwood. "Doctor," Blackwood's voice was barely above a whisper. "There must be some mistake." Dr. Mitchell had anticipated this moment since the birth. "There is no mistake, Mr. Blackwood. This is definitely the child Mrs. O'Brien carried to term, but it appears the father is not who you expected." The implications crashed over Blackwood like a locomotive at full speed. Margaret O'Brien had been with another man, someone whose heritage included African blood in a time when such unions faced severe social and legal restrictions. In 1886 Pennsylvania, miscegenation laws had only recently been repealed, but social acceptance lagged far behind legal changes. Upstairs, Margaret had overheard enough of the conversation to understand what had transpired. She closed her eyes, knowing the moment of truth had arrived earlier than expected. She had hoped to find a way to explain before the birth, but circumstances had moved too quickly. When Blackwood returned to her room, carrying the baby, his face showed a mixture of emotions she could not fully read. Anger, certainly, but also something that might have been curiosity or even admiration. "Who is the father?" he asked simply. Margaret met his gaze directly. "Samuel Washington. He worked the night shift, laying track on the Eastern Expansion. We were together for 3 months after my husband died, before you made your proposition." Samuel Washington had been one of the few Negro workers employed by the Pennsylvania Railroad, hired during a labor shortage despite the prejudices of the time. He was intelligent, hard-working, and had treated Margaret with a kindness she had not experienced since her husband's death. Their relationship had ended when he accepted a position with the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, seeking better opportunities in a less hostile environment. Blackwood stood silently for several minutes, looking down at the child who would never inherit his railroad empire, at least not in the way he had planned. The baby stirred in his arms, opening her eyes to look up at him with an expression of innocent trust. The industrial age had created new possibilities and new complications, but it had not yet created a society ready to accept a mixed-race heiress to a railroad fortune. Outside, the evening locomotive whistle sounded across the snow-covered city, calling workers home from another day of building America's industrial future, unaware that the future had just become far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. For 3 days, Cornelius Blackwood wrestled with a decision that would define not only his legacy, but challenge everything he believed about family, society, and his own character. The baby remained in Margaret's care at the boarding house while he retreated to his mansion on Fifth Avenue, ostensibly to recover from a sudden illness that kept him away from railroad business. His wife Eleanor noticed his distraction immediately. A perceptive woman of refined education and genuine compassion, she had married Blackwood 15 years earlier, when he was still building his fortune. Their inability to have children had been a source of quiet sorrow between them, discussed in whispered conversations and unspoken glances across their dining room table. "Cornelius, you've barely touched your dinner for 3 nights," Eleanor observed, as they sat in their formal dining room beneath a crystal chandelier imported from Vienna. "The servants are beginning to worry, and frankly, so am I." Blackwood set down his fork, looking across the mahogany table at the woman who had stood beside him through every triumph and setback of his railroad empire. Eleanor's blonde hair was beginning to show threads of silver, and lines of concern creased her gentle face. She deserved honesty, or at least as much honesty as their society would permit. "Eleanor, I have been considering a proposition that could change our lives significantly. There is a child, an infant, whose parents have died. The baby needs a home, and we have the means to provide excellent care." Eleanor's face brightened with an expression of hope she had not dared show in years. "An infant? Cornelius, do you truly mean it?" The ease with which she embraced the possibility only deepened his internal conflict. Eleanor would welcome any child with open arms, but would society accept what he was contemplating? More importantly, what would happen to his business empire if word spread that the Blackwood heir was of mixed race? Meanwhile, at the boarding house, Margaret tended to her daughter with a mixture of love and growing anxiety. She had named the baby Rose, after her own mother, who had died during the crossing from Ireland. Dr. Mitchell visited daily, ostensibly for medical checkups, but actually to monitor the increasingly complicated situation. "Mr. Blackwood has not sent word about the final payment," Margaret mentioned during one of these visits. Dr. Mitchell set down her medical bag and spoke carefully. "Mrs. O'Brien, you must understand that this situation has become far more complex than anyone anticipated. There are social considerations that go beyond your original agreement." Margaret understood perfectly. In 1886, even in the relatively progressive industrial cities of Pennsylvania, a mixed-race child faced enormous obstacles. The baby would be denied access to most schools, excluded from respectable society, and face legal restrictions in many aspects of life. Yet she also knew that Blackwood's wealth and influence could overcome many of these barriers if he chose to use them. On the 4th day, Blackwood returned to the boarding house. He found Margaret in the small parlour, nursing baby Rose while reading a book about railroad engineering she had borrowed from his personal library. The domestic scene struck him unexpectedly, reminding him of conversations they had shared during the pregnancy about industry, progress, and the changing nature of American society. "I have made my decision," he announced without preamble. Margaret looked up from the baby, her green eyes steady despite the uncertainty she felt. "And what have you decided, Mr. Blackwood?" "I will honor our original agreement completely. You will receive the full payment as promised, but I will also make you a different offer entirely." He sat across from her, his voice taking on the tone he used when negotiating major business deals. "I want you to remain in Pittsburgh. I will establish you in a proper house with a monthly allowance sufficient for comfortable living. Rose will be educated privately, receiving the finest tutoring available. When she comes of age, if she chooses, she will have a position within my railroad company." Margaret felt her heart racing. "And in return?" "Rose will be raised knowing who her real parents are. She will understand that she has a place in this world, not as my acknowledged heir, but as someone I care about and will protect. It is not the arrangement we originally discussed, but it may be better for everyone involved." The offer was more generous than Margaret had dared hope, yet it also represented a fundamental shift in their relationship. Instead of a simple business transaction, Blackwood was proposing something approaching an unconventional family arrangement. "There is one more thing," Blackwood continued. "I have written to the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, inquiring about Samuel Washington's current position. If he is interested in returning to Pittsburgh, I will offer him employment with better wages and opportunities for advancement." Margaret stared at him in amazement. "You would do that? Rose deserves to know her father, just as she deserves every opportunity we can provide. The world is changing, Mrs. O'Brien. Perhaps not as quickly as we might wish, but it is changing. This child may grow up in a very different America than the one we know today." Outside, the late afternoon train whistle announced the arrival of the eastbound express, carrying passengers and freight toward a future that none of them could fully predict. In the parlor of a Pittsburgh boarding house, 3 people contemplated a decision that would challenge social conventions and create an unconventional family bound together by circumstance, choice, and an infant whose very existence represented both the complications and possibilities of America's industrial age. Spring arrived in Pittsburgh with the familiar symphony of industrial progress. Steam engines whistled across the expanding rail network. Construction crews hammered new tracks into place, and the Allegheny River carried barges loaded with coal and steel toward distant markets. But in a modest 2-story house on Webster Avenue, a different kind of progress was taking shape. Margaret O'Brien had accepted Blackwood's offer, and within 6 weeks, she and baby Rose were settled into their new home. The house was furnished simply but comfortably, with a small library, a modern kitchen, and a nursery filled with afternoon sunlight. For the first time since her husband's death, Margaret felt something approaching security. Samuel Washington had indeed returned to Pittsburgh, accepting a position as a track supervisor with the Pennsylvania Railroad at wages considerably higher than his previous employment. His reunion with Margaret and his first meeting with baby Rose had been awkward initially, but the bond between father and daughter formed quickly. Rose seemed to recognize something familiar in Samuel's gentle voice and steady presence. The arrangement required delicate navigation of social conventions. To their neighbors, Margaret was a widow receiving assistance from a benevolent railroad executive, while Samuel was simply a skilled worker who occasionally visited friends in the area. The truth was more complex, but it worked within the constraints of 1886 society. Cornelius Blackwood found himself visiting Webster Avenue more frequently than business required. Initially, he told himself these visits were necessary to monitor his investment and ensure the arrangement functioned smoothly. But increasingly, he looked forward to the conversations with Margaret about books, current events, and the changing industrial landscape. Watching Rose develop from an infant into a curious, intelligent child provided unexpected satisfaction. Eleanor Blackwood had initially been disappointed when the promised orphan child did not materialize, but her husband's explanation about the family changing their minds seemed to satisfy her concern. She channeled her maternal instincts into charitable work with Pittsburgh's growing population of immigrant families, never suspecting the truth about her husband's frequent business trips to Webster Avenue. By Rose's 2nd birthday, the unconventional family had established its own rhythms and traditions. Samuel taught the child simple words and songs from his own childhood, While Margaret provided formal education in reading and mathematics, Blackwood contributed books, toys, and stories about the wider world beyond Pittsburgh's industrial boundaries. The railroad empire continued expanding under Blackwood's leadership. New lines stretched westward toward Chicago and southward into Virginia, carrying passengers and freight that fueled America's rapid industrialization. His wealth grew accordingly, and with it, his ability to protect and provide for the small family on Webster Avenue. Rose Washington O'Brien, as she came to be known in private documents, grew into a bright, curious child who moved easily between the different aspects of her heritage. She learned Irish folk songs from Margaret, work songs from Samuel, and proper English grammar from the private tutors Blackwood provided. By age 5, she could read as well as many 10-year-olds and showed particular interest in maps and mechanical drawings. The secret of her parentage remained carefully guarded, though Dr. Sarah Mitchell occasionally wondered what would happen as Rose grew older and her mixed heritage became more apparent. In a rapidly changing America, perhaps such questions would matter less with each passing year. Samuel proved himself an exceptional track supervisor, implementing safety innovations that reduced workplace accidents and earned respect from workers who had initially been skeptical of his promotion. His relationship with Margaret deepened over time, eventually leading to a quiet wedding ceremony, attended only by Dr. Mitchell and witnessed by a justice of the peace who asked no uncomfortable questions. Blackwood attended the small celebration afterward in the Webster Avenue house, raising a glass of champagne to toast their happiness. The scene would have been scandalous to Pittsburgh society, but within the walls of that modest home, it felt natural and right. As 1891 dawned, Rose was 5 years old, speaking fluent English and showing signs of the intelligence both her parents possessed. She called Samuel Papa, Margaret Mama, and Blackwood Uncle Cornelius, never questioning why her family looked different from others in the neighborhood. The industrial age had created new possibilities for unconventional arrangements, and in their own quiet way, the residents of Webster Avenue had created something unprecedented. A multiracial family bound together not by legal conventions, but by genuine affection and shared commitment to one child's future. On warm summer evenings, they would sit on the front porch, listening to the distant sound of locomotives carrying America toward the 20th century, while Rose played with wooden trains and dreamed of adventures beyond the steel rails that connected their small world to the vast possibilities of a changing nation. The railroad tycoon had indeed been shocked by the truth, but the shock had transformed into something far more valuable than the simple air he had originally sought to purchase.